In the humid swamplands of southern Louisiana, specifically in a small, unmapped garage just off Interstate 10, there was a man who understood something about internal combustion that the entire engineering department of the National Hot Rod Association had completely missed. It was 1984. The sport of drag racing was shifting from a wild, unregulated frontier into a corporate-sponsored billboard era, and the rulebook was becoming thicker than a Bible. But this mechanic, let's just call him Doc because that's what the locals called anyone who could fix a big block Chevy with a stethoscope and a screwdriver, didn't care about the corporate shift. He cared about one thing: the specific energy density of methanol when it interacted with humidity. Doc knew that in the suffocating heat of a Louisiana summer, engines choked. The air was too thick with water vapor, the oxygen density dropped, and horsepower vanished. Every racer in the division fought the same battle. They tuned their carburetors, they advanced their timing, and they prayed for a cool breeze that never came. But Doc didn't pray. He did chemistry. He realized that if he couldn't change the air going into the engine, he had to change the fuel waiting in the tank. And what he cooked up in that bayou garage wasn't just an additive. It was a chemical weapon that would spark a 5-year cat-and-mouse game with the most powerful sanctioning body in motorsports. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the gray areas of racing history where the rulebook ends and the cheating begins. If you're someone who loves stories about mechanical ingenuity, forbidden chemistry, and the little guys who outsmart the billion-dollar teams, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Here's the thing about cheating in racing. It's rarely about breaking a rule that explicitly exists. It's usually about finding a gap where a rule should be but isn't. In 1984, the NHRA rules regarding fuel in the sportsman classes were surprisingly simple. If you were running a gas class, you ran gasoline. If you were running an alcohol class, you ran methanol. The enforcement mechanism for this was a tool called a hydrometer. It's a simple glass tube that floats in a sample of liquid. Depending on how high or low it floats, it tells you the specific gravity, basically the density of the fuel. Now, you might be thinking, that sounds foolproof. If you add something to the fuel, the density changes, the float moves, and you get caught. And for 99% of the racers trying to sneak a little nitro into their tanks, that's exactly what happened. Nitromethane is heavy. You pour it into gasoline or methanol, and the specific gravity shoots up. The hydrometer sinks. You go home disqualified. But Doc wasn't interested in nitromethane. He was interested in a class of chemicals known as epoxides, specifically a nasty, volatile, cancer-causing liquid called propylene oxide. Propylene oxide is terrifying stuff. It's used industrially to make polyurethane plastics, but in an engine, it acts as an oxygenate. It carries its own oxygen atoms into the combustion chamber. When it burns fast and hot, effectively increasing the octane rating and the flame speed of the mixture. But here is the genius part, the part that Doc figured out while sweating through his shirt in that Louisiana garage. Propylene oxide has a specific gravity of roughly 0.83. Pure methanol is about 0.79. They are close, very close. If you just dumped a gallon of propylene oxide into your fuel cell, the hydrometer would catch it. The density would shift just enough to look suspicious. But Doc realized that the density of fuel changes with temperature. Cold fuel is denser, hot fuel is lighter. In the blistering heat of a Louisiana track day, the fuel in everyone's tank was expanding, becoming less dense. Doc found that if he mixed a precise 8% ratio of propylene oxide with his methanol, the mixture should have been too heavy. But if he kept that fuel mixture chilled in an ice chest until the very last second before the run, and then accounted for the 95-degree ambient temperature expanding the liquid in the tank, the specific gravity would settle right into the legal range on the inspector's hydrometer for the 10 minutes that mattered. He wasn't just cheating the chemistry, he was cheating the physics of thermal expansion. The first time he tested it was at a divisional meet near Baton Rouge. The car was a 1969 Camaro. Ragged around the edges, primer spots on the fenders, looking like every other bracket racer's weekend project. The driver, a local kid who didn't know a covalent bond from a lug nut, just knew that Doc had tuned it up. When they rolled into the staging lanes, the air was thick enough to drink. Density altitude was over 3,000 feet. Engines were wheezing all around them. The Camaro fired up, and immediately the exhaust note was different. It didn't have the lazy lope of a methanol motor struggling in the heat. It had a sharp, crackling crispness to it. Here's what most people don't realize about drag racing. It's an auditory sport. You can hear horsepower, and you can definitely hear weird horsepower. The Camaro staged, the tree dropped, and the car didn't just leave, it evaporated. It cut a 60-foot time that belonged in a different class. At the 8th mile marker, it was pulling like a freight train. When it crossed the stripe, the wind light came on. But more importantly, the elapsed time was 0.2 of a second faster than the car had ever run before. In a sport where people spend $10,000 to find 0.02 of a second, 0.2 is an eternity. It's the difference between a photo finish and a massacre. Doc stood by the fence, watching the numbers flash on the board, and he didn't smile. He knew exactly what had just happened. The propylene oxide had effectively brought its own atmosphere into the cylinders, ignoring the humid Louisiana air outside. The engine was breathing sea-level air in a swamp. But then came the dreaded wave. The tech inspector at the end of the track pointed the Camaro toward the scales and the fuel check station. This was a moment of truth. The inspector, a grizzled veteran who had seen every trick from nitrous lines hidden in roll cages to lead shot in the frame rails, popped the fuel cap. He lowered his nose to the tank. He frowned. "Smells sweet," the inspector grunted. "It's the new additive package from VP," Doc lied, his voice a slow, unbothered drawl. "Supposed to help with the top-end lube." The inspector pulled a sample. He dropped the hydrometer in. Doc watched the glass float bob in the clear liquid. It settled. It held. It was right on the line, the absolute upper limit of the allowable specific gravity for methanol, but technically, legally, inside the line. The temperature calculation had worked. The inspector stared at it for a long moment, tapped the glass to make sure it wasn't sticking, and then shrugged. "Pass," he said. That single word, pass, was the spark that lit the fuse on one of the most secretive and explosive cheating scandals in the Southern Division. Because Doc didn't stop there. He went home, looked at his data, and realized that if 8% worked, he could go higher. But to go higher, he would need to defeat the hydrometer completely. He needed to find a chemical that was lighter than methanol to balance out the heavy propylene oxide, creating a neutral density blend that was chemically supercharged, but physically indistinguishable from stock fuel. He needed to build a ghost fuel. And to do that, he would have to turn his garage into a full-blown chemistry lab, sourcing chemicals that were usually restricted to industrial manufacturing plants. The Louisiana Blend was born. But what Doc didn't know was that he wasn't the only one suspicious of the sudden performance jump. The NHRA was beginning to hear rumors, and they were about to bring something to the track that a simple hydrometer couldn't fight. Look, successful cheating isn't about being invisible. It's about being boring. Doc understood this better than anyone. If you show up to the track with a car that looks like a spaceship and runs a second faster than the national record, they will tear your engine apart bolt by bolt. They will measure the displacement, they will CC the heads, they will check the cam lift. But if you show up with a car that looks like a beater, runs just 0.2 faster than it should, and you pass the initial inspection with shrug, you become a legend. By the spring of 1985, Doc wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was a phantom chemist. The initial success with the 8% mixture had emboldened him. He realized that the specific gravity test, the hydrometer, was a binary lock that he had picked. But the problem with propylene oxide, beyond the fact that it is incredibly carcinogenic, is that it is heavy. As I mentioned, it sits at about 0.83 specific gravity. Methanol is 0.79. Every drop of pop, as the racers started calling it, he added made the fuel heavier. He hit a ceiling. He couldn't add more power without the hydrometer sinking like a stone and getting him banned for life. So he needed a counterweight. He needed a chemical that was lighter than methanol, combustible, and miscible, meaning it would mix without separating. Now, you might be thinking, why not just use gasoline? Gasoline is lighter, around 0.74, but gasoline and methanol don't like to mix without help. And more importantly, gasoline smells like gasoline. If a tech inspector opened a tank of methanol and got a whiff of Chevron Supreme, the gig would be up instantly. Doc needed something odorless, or at least something that didn't smell like a felony. He found his answer in the industrial solvents aisle: acetone. Acetone is light, with a specific gravity of roughly 0.784. It's extremely flammable, and it mixes with methanol perfectly. Doc started running the math in his notebook. If he added 15% propylene oxide, heavy, to get the massive oxygen boost, the fuel would be way too dense. But if he cut that mixture with a precise amount of acetone, light, and a splash of another solvent called toluene to stabilize the burn, he could pull the total specific gravity back down to exactly 0.795. He had created a neutral density bomb. To the hydrometer, it looked exactly like pure methanol. To the engine, it was liquid dynamite. This is where things started to get out of hand. Doc wasn't just tuning his own cars anymore. He realized there was a market gap. He started mixing 55-gallon drums of this Louisiana Blend in his shop and selling it to select racers. He didn't tell them what was in it. He just told them, don't get it on your paint, don't breathe the fumes, and don't pour it in until you're in the staging lanes. The results were statistically impossible to ignore. In the 1985 Division 4 season, a sudden cluster of racers who had previously been mid-pack fillers suddenly started dominating. We're talking about guys who had struggled to run 1050s, suddenly punching out consistent 1030s in the heat of the day. One racer, a customer of Doc's, driving a Plymouth Duster, went from qualifying 12th to winning 3 consecutive divisional events. Here's the thing about racers. They are paranoid by nature. When one guy wins, it's luck. When 5 guys from the same area start winning, it's a conspiracy. The pit started buzzing. People walked by Doc's customers' cars and sniffed the air. The exhaust didn't burn your eyes like raw methanol usually does. It had a sweet, almost candy-like aroma. It smelled expensive. Complaints started flooding the NHRA tech trailer. Check their fuel, the losing drivers demanded. They're running nitro. They're running nitrous in the tank. They're running rocket fuel. The NHRA tech directors were frustrated. They were checking the fuel. Every time a Louisiana Blend car won, they pulled a sample. They dropped the hydrometer in. It floated perfectly. They checked the color. It was clear. They did the water test, a crude method where you mix the fuel with water to see if any oil-based additives separate out. Because Doc's mixture was fully water-soluble, it passed that too. The inspectors knew they were being played, but they couldn't prove how. It was the perfect crime, hidden in plain sight inside a fuel cell. But here is what most people don't realize about the arms race in motorsports. It forces the sanctioning body to evolve. The NHRA wasn't stupid. They knew that hydrometers were 1950s technology trying to police 1980s chemistry. They started hearing whispers about propylene oxide. The rumor mill was churning. So, in late 1985, at a major event in Dallas, the NHRA tried a new tactic. They didn't have the advanced lab equipment on site yet. That stuff cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and was the size of a refrigerator. Instead, they brought in a sniffer. It was a handheld device from the mining industry designed to detect hazardous vapors. It wasn't calibrated for racing fuel. It was designed to keep coal miners from blowing up. Doc was at that event. He saw the tech officials walking down the staging lanes with this strange, beeping yellow box. Most mechanics would have panicked. They would have drained their tanks, poured in legal methanol, and accepted the loss. But Doc, he did something brazen. He walked right up to the tech director, holding a red rag, and asked, "What's the Geiger counter for? We worried about radiation now?" The director, tired and sweating, looked at him and said, "It detects organic vapors. Anything that ain't methanol is going to set this thing off." Doc nodded, went back to his car, and told his driver, "Pop the hood." Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Doc knew the sniffer picked up vapors. So, he grabbed the bottle of Top Lube, a legal scented lubricant additive that everyone used to keep the alcohol from drying out the cylinder walls. He poured an ungodly amount of it into the fuel cell vent tube. He literally soaked the breather filter in it. This legal lube smelled like grape and was thick, oily stuff. When the tech official walked by the car with a sniffer, the machine went haywire. It started screaming. The official looked at the car, then looked at the vent tube dripping with purple oil. "It's just the lube, Chief," Doc said, holding up the legal bottle. "I didn't want the fuel pump to seize up in this heat." The official looked at the machine, which was unable to distinguish between the legal lube vapors and the illegal oxide vapors because the sensor was overwhelmed. He shut the machine off, annoyed. "Clean that mess up," he barked, and walked to the next car. Doc had effectively jammed the radar. The car went on to win the class. But that victory was the beginning of the end for the Wild West era. That moment in Dallas proved to the NHRA that field tests were useless. They couldn't rely on gadgets or gravity. If they wanted to catch the Louisiana Blend, they needed to see the molecules. They needed to stop looking at the fuel's properties and start looking at its fingerprint. The order came down from NHRA headquarters in California. Find the budget for a portable gas chromatograph. Doc didn't know what a gas chromatograph was yet, but he was about to find out. And the chemicals he was using, specifically the propylene oxide, had a molecular signature so distinct that once the NHRA figured out how to look for it, it would shine like a neon sign in the dark. The trap was being built, but Doc, confident in his undefeated season, was already working on version 3.0 of the blend. He wasn't just going to beat the hydrometer anymore. He was planning to beat the lab itself. By the winter of 1986, the landscape of sportsman's drag racing had shifted from a physical battleground to a digital one, though nobody in the pits realized it yet. While Doc was busy refining his specific gravity cocktails in Louisiana, the NHRA was busy writing checks to Hewlett-Packard. They weren't buying more hydrometers, they were buying the first generation of portable gas chromatographs. Now, unless you have a degree in chemical engineering, gas chromatograph probably sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. But to understand why this was the nuclear option for the sanctioning body, you have to understand what it actually does. A hydrometer asks, how heavy is this fluid? A sniffer asks, is this fluid evaporating? But a gas chromatograph asks, what exactly is this fluid made of, molecule by molecule? Here is the best way to visualize it. Imagine you have a fruit smoothie. A hydrometer can tell you the smoothie weighs 1 pound. It can't tell you if it's strawberry, banana, or hemlock. A gas chromatograph, however, takes that smoothie, vaporizes it into a gas, and pushes it through a microscopic tube, called a column, that is coated with a special polymer. Different molecules travel through this tube at different speeds. The strawberries might race through in 2 seconds, the bananas in 5, and the hemlock in 10. By measuring exactly when each part of the gas exits the tube, the machine creates a graph. A peak appears at the 2-second mark, another at 5, another at 10. If the NHRA has a map that says methanol comes out at 3 seconds, and your fuel sample has a massive spike at 3 seconds and nothing else, you are legal. But if your sample has a spike at 3 seconds, methanol, and a smaller, suspicious spike at 4.2 seconds, you are caught. That little extra spike is the signature of your additive. It is a fingerprint that you cannot erase. The first time this machine appeared at a divisional event in Texas, it was a bloodbath. They didn't announce it. They set it up in a restricted tent near the fuel check station. They called it the lab, but really it was just 2 guys in polo shirts staring at a computer screen that was printing out jagged lines on dot matrix paper. Doc wasn't at this race, but his phone started ringing late Saturday night. It was one of his best customers, a guy who ran a super comp dragster. "They got Miller," the driver whispered, sounding like he was calling from a payphone in a war zone. "They got Stevens too. Disqualified, banned for a year. They have a machine, Doc. It sees everything." Doc asked for details. He wanted to know what the graph looked like. He wanted to know what questions they asked. He realized immediately that his neutral density trick, the delicate balance of heavy propylene oxide and light acetone, was now his death sentence. To a gas chromatograph, density is irrelevant. The machine would simply separate the mixture into its components. It would show a huge peak for methanol, a medium peak for acetone, and a distinct peak for propylene oxide. It wouldn't just show that he was cheating, it would show the exact recipe he was using. The Louisiana Blend was dead. But here is where it gets really interesting. Most cheaters would quit here. The risk was no longer just a disqualified run, it was a reputation-destroying ban. But Doc was addicted to the problem-solving. He obtained a copy of the graph from one of the disqualified racers, a crumpled piece of paper retrieved from a trash can. He studied it for days. He noticed something critical about the NHRA's early testing protocol. The machine was calibrated to look for specific, known cheater chemicals: nitromethane, propylene oxide, hydrazine. These chemicals had known retention times. The machine knew exactly when to look for them. If a chemical appeared at a time the machine wasn't looking for, it often just registered as background noise or hydrocarbon contamination, which could be explained away as dirty fuel lines or residue from a fuel jug. The flaw in the NHRA strategy was that they were looking for specific needles in the haystack. Doc realized he just needed to build a needle made of hay. He needed an oxygenant that was chemically similar enough to methanol that it would hide inside the methanol peak on the graph, or appear so close to it that the operator couldn't distinguish the two. He needed a chemical cousin. He found it in a textbook from the 1940s, 1,4-dioxane. Dioxane is an ether. It's miscible in water and alcohol. It's flammable. And crucially, its boiling point and molecular behavior were somewhat distinct, but Doc theorized that if he mixed it with another alcohol, like ethanol or isopropanol, he could blur the lines. He wasn't trying to make the additive invisible, he was trying to make the peak on the graph look like a shoulder. Imagine the graph shows a sharp mountain for methanol. If you add a chemical that exits the tube just a fraction of a second later, it doesn't create a separate mountain. It just makes the methanol mountain look a little whiter, a little fatter on the right side. Doc mixed a new batch. He called it Blend X. It was far more complex than the propylene oxide mix. It used dioxane for the oxygen kick, but he masked it with a high volume of ethanol. The idea was to overwhelm the sensor with legal alcohols so that the illegal ether would get lost in the data wash. He sent a sample to a commercial lab in Houston first, under a fake company name, asking for a purity analysis. The report came back: 90% methanol, 5% ethanol, 5% unidentified organic ethers. Unidentified, that was the word he was looking for. If a commercial lab couldn't name it, the tech inspector in a tent in Oklahoma definitely couldn't. Doc returned to the track in late 1986 with a new customer, a Corvette Roadster running in super gas. The car was fast, not suspiciously fast like the propylene oxide cars, but efficiently fast. It was consistent. It printed time slips. They won the first round, then the second. At the field check, the inspector took the sample. He walked it over to the tent. He injected it into the gas chromatograph. Doc stood outside, watching the inspector's face through the mesh window. The printer started screeching. The graph came out. The inspector frowned. He looked at the graph. He looked at his reference sheet. The peak for methanol was there, but it looked chubby. It was wide. There was a weird tail on the end of it. The machine didn't flag any banned substances because dioxane wasn't in its library of banned peaks. It just saw a lot of alcohol. The inspector came out holding the paper. "Your fuel is dirty," he said, accusingly. "You got a lot of ethanol in here. Some other junk?" "I buy the cheap stuff," Doc said, shrugging. "My fuel supplier cuts it with ethanol sometimes. Is that illegal?" Ethanol was legal. It wasn't preferred because it made less power than methanol usually, but it wasn't banned. The inspector hesitated. He knew something was off. The graph looked ugly, but he couldn't point to a specific spike and say, "That is propylene oxide." He couldn't point to a spike and say, "That is nitro." He just saw a messy, wide blob of alcohol readings. He couldn't disqualify a man for having a messy fuel. "Clean your tank out before the next race," the inspector warned. "Pass." Doc walked away with his heart hammering in his throat. He had beaten the machine. He had found the blind spot in the digital eye. He wasn't hiding the chemicals anymore. He was camouflaging them. He was using the machine's own limitations against it. But this victory was dangerous. It made him arrogant. And while Doc was playing chemist in Louisiana, the NHRA was about to receive a tip from a source they never expected. A source that would expose the masking technique and force Doc into his final, most desperate innovation. The tip didn't come from a rival mechanic.
It didn't come from a disgruntled driver who lost a race. It came from the most unlikely place imaginable, a fertilizer salesman in rural Arkansas. See, to make Blend X work at scale, Doc needed large quantities of industrial solvents, specifically the dioxane and the high-grade ethanol he was using as a masking agent. He was buying these chemicals through a shell company he had set up, ostensibly for agricultural equipment cleaning. But in late 1987, a salesman noticed that this small cleaning company in Louisiana was ordering chemical volumes that rivaled large manufacturing plants. The salesman mentioned it to his brother-in-law, who just happened to be a regional tech director for the NHRA. "I don't know what they're cleaning," the salesman said over a beer, "but they're buying enough solvent to strip the paint off a battleship." The brother-in-law's ears perked up. He ran the name of the company. It traced back to a P.O. box in the same town where a certain Doc had his garage. The NHRA realized they weren't dealing with a few guys mixing fuel in a bathtub anymore. They were dealing with a supply chain. This triggered a massive internal shift at the sanctioning body. They stopped looking for the magic bullet chemical and started looking at the purity of the fuel itself. They realized that if they couldn't identify the specific cheating agent because it was hidden inside the alcohol peak, they simply had to tighten the definition of methanol. For the 1988 season, the rulebook changed. It no longer just listed banned substances. It now stated that fuel must be commercial-grade A methanol. And critically, it added a purity standard. Fuel samples must contain no less than 99.5% methanol by volume, with no detectable additives other than approved top lubes. This was a sledgehammer. It didn't matter if the additive was dioxane, ethanol, or unicorn tears. If the gas chromatograph showed any deviation from a pure, sharp methanol peak, if that mountain looked even slightly chubby or had a shoulder, it was an automatic disqualification. The masking strategy was illegal by default because the mask itself, the ethanol, was now a violation of the purity standard. Doc read the new rulebook and felt a cold knot in his stomach. His dirty fuel excuse wouldn't work anymore. If his fuel wasn't 99.5% pure methanol, he was out. He had to find a way to add energy to the fuel without adding volume to the fuel. He needed something potent enough that he could use it in microscopic amounts, parts per million rather than percentages, so that it wouldn't show up as a distinct peak on the graph at 1988-era chromatographs. The machine sensitivity wasn't high enough to see it. It just looked like background noise, a tiny blip on the baseline that the operator would ignore as static. But even at 0.1%, compound Z had a catalytic effect on combustion. It didn't just add oxygen, it destabilized the methanol molecules, making them break down faster and burn more violently. It was like adding a caffeine shot to the fuel. It wasn't the 10% horsepower gain of the propylene oxide days. It was maybe 2 or 3%. But in a class decided by inches, 3% is everything. Doc mixed the test batch. He gave it to his most trusted driver, a guy running a dragster in top alcohol. This is it, the invisible hand. They went to the Gator Nationals in Florida, a huge event. The dragster ran flawlessly. It wasn't setting world records, but it was winning rounds. It was consistent. It was fast. At the field check, the inspector ran the sample. The chromatograph spit out the graph. A single, sharp, beautiful peak for methanol. No shoulders, no wide base, no secondary spikes. The purity looked to be 99.9%. "Cleanest fuel I've seen all day," the inspector said, handing the sample bottle back. Doc had done it. He had found the ghost particle. For the entire 1988 season, his cars ran Compound Z. They won championships, they set divisional records, and nobody had a clue. The NHRA thought they had won the war because the obvious cheating had stopped. They patted themselves on the back, thinking the new purity rules had scared everyone straight. But victory makes you careless, and chemistry is unforgiving. The problem with Compound Z was its instability. It was a nitrate. Nitrates degrade over time, especially when exposed to UV light or heat. Doc always mixed the fuel fresh, right before the race, but one of his customers, a guy who bought a 5-gallon jug of the special sauce for a race in Memphis, didn't use it all. He left the jug sitting in the back of his trailer in the sweltering heat for 3 weeks. He showed up to the next race in Tulsa and poured the old fuel into his tank. He didn't tell Doc, he just assumed it was still good. He made a run. The car was fast. He won the round. He went to fuel check. The inspector drew the sample, but this time the sample wasn't clear. It had a faint yellowish tint. The heat had caused a compound Z to break down, and as it degraded, it released nitrogen dioxide, a reddish-brown gas that dissolved into the liquid. "Why is your fuel yellow?" the inspector asked. Maybe the jug was dirty," the driver stammered. The inspector put it in the chromatograph, but he didn't just run the standard test. Because of the color, he ran a slow scan, a deeper, more sensitive analysis designed to identify contaminants. The machine hummed. The graph started printing. There was the methanol peak, but this time, way down the line, in the section usually reserved for heavy oils, there was a new mountain, a jagged, ugly, chaotic spike caused by the degraded nitrate byproducts. He stared at it. He had never seen that chemical signature before. It didn't match propylene oxide. It didn't match dioxane. It looked like fertilizer bomb residue. He called the head of the department. They impounded the fuel. They impounded the car. They sent the sample to a university lab for mass spectrometry, the big guns. When the results came back 2 weeks later, the NHRA didn't just ban the driver. They panicked. The report identified nitrates consistent with high explosives. They thought they were dealing with a domestic terrorism issue, not a fuel cheat. The FBI was briefly notified. Doc heard about the bust before the feds got involved. He realized the game had escalated from sporting violation to national security interest. He cleaned out his garage that night. Every drum, every notebook, every crystal of Compound Z went into a burn pit in the deep bayou. He scrubbed the floor with bleach. He dismantled his mixing equipment and scattered the pieces in 3 different parishes. When the NHRA investigators finally traced the yellow fuel back to the driver cracked. He gave them Doc's name. But when they arrived at the garage in Louisiana, they found nothing. Just a clean shop, a 1969 Camaro on jack stands, and a mechanic tuning a carburetor. "I just fix cars," Doc told them, wiping grease from his hands. "I don't know nothing about chemistry." They couldn't prove anything. The physical evidence was gone. But the message was received. The era of the Louisiana Blend was over. The NHRA implemented new testing protocols specifically for nitrates, and the loophole closed forever. But here's the thing about legends. They don't just disappear, they mutate. Doc stopped mixing fuel, but he didn't stop thinking. And as he watched the NHRA inspectors high-fiving each other for cleaning up the sport, he noticed something else. While they were all staring at the fuel tanks, obsessing over chemistry, nobody was looking at the air intake. Nobody was looking at the oxygen before it hit the fuel. And that gave him one final, brilliant idea. An idea that didn't involve fuel at all. An idea that would lead to the single most controversial run in the history of the division. While the NHRA inspectors were high-fiving each other over their gas chromatographs and purity standards, Doc was sitting on his porch, drinking sweet tea and staring at a bicycle tire pump. He realized he had been fighting the wrong battle. He had been obsessed with the liquid in the tank, trying to chemically densify the fuel. But an internal combustion engine is, fundamentally, just an air pump. Fuel is secondary, it's just the catalyst. The real limit to horsepower in a naturally aspirated engine isn't the fuel, it's the oxygen. If you can shove more oxygen into the cylinder, you can burn more fuel and you make more power. The inspectors were looking down at the fuel lines. Doc decided to look up at the intake. He spent the winter of 1989 working on the Camaro's chassis. He told everyone he was stiffening the frame to handle the launch torque. He welded in a new crossmember, he reinforced the roll cage, but what he was actually doing was turning the car's structural tubing into a high-pressure storage vessel. He drilled tiny, microscopic holes into the base of the carburetor mounting studs. He ran hidden lines through the intake manifold casting itself, lines so well hidden you would have to X-ray the manifold to find them. These lines connected to the hollow tubing of the roll cage, and inside that roll cage, pressurized to 900 psi, was not air, but pure nitrous oxide.
Here's the thing about nitrous oxide. It's not a fuel, it's an oxidizer. It brings its own atmosphere to the party. Usually, you need a big blue bottle, braided lines, and solenoids, all things that get you disqualified immediately in a naturally aspirated class. But Doc didn't use a bottle. The car was the bottle. He installed a tiny manual valve under the driver's seat, disguised as a seat adjustment lever. When the driver pulled the lever, it cracked the valve, bleeding the pressurized gas from the roll cage into the intake manifold right under the carburetor. It wasn't a massive 200 horsepower shot like the Pro mods use. It was a subtle, steady stream, maybe 40 or 50 horsepower, just enough to crush the competition without breaking parts. The system was genius because it bypassed the fuel check entirely. The gas chromatograph analyzes liquid fuel. It doesn't analyze the air the engine is breathing. Doc brought the car to the Division 4 season opener in 1989. The atmosphere in the pits was tense. Everyone knew the NHRA was cracking down. Drivers were walking on eggshells. When Doc's Camaro rolled into the staging lanes, the tech inspectors descended on it like vultures. They took a fuel sample before the run. "Run it," the inspector said, holding the vial. "It tests clean." It was legal methanol, 99.9% pure. The driver staged the car. The tree dropped. He pulled the seat adjustment lever. The Camaro launched with a violence that made the crowd gasp. It carried the front wheels past a 60-foot mark. It screamed down the track, the engine note possessing that distinct, angry, hard-edge wail that only comes from nitrous oxide. It crossed the finish line 3 car lengths ahead of the runner-up. The scoreboard lit up, a number that was 0.2 faster than the class index. It was a breakout performance that shouldn't have been physically possible on a humid day with a legal engine. The tower red-lighted him for breaking out, but the message was sent. The car was a rocket ship. The tech director was furious. He ordered the car to the barn immediately. "Tear it down," he commanded. They spent 3 hours dissecting that Camaro. They drained the fuel. Clean. They removed the carburetor and measured the venturis. Legal. They took off the cylinder heads to check the displacement. Legal. They checked the cam lift. Legal. They even cut open the fuel filter to see if he was hiding a pill in there. Nothing. They stood around the disassembled carcass of the car, covered in grease, baffled. The tech director kicked the tire in frustration. "I know he's cheating. I just don't know how." He was standing right next to the roll cage. If he had just tapped it with a wrench, he might have heard the distinct ping of high-pressure tubing. If he had opened the valve under the seat, he would have heard the hiss of the escaping gas. But he was looking for complex chemistry, not simple plumbing. Doc stood in the corner of the barn, cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife, watching them sweat. He knew he had won the ultimate victory. He had forced them to look at everything, and they had found nothing. They released the car. Doc loaded it onto the trailer in silence. He never raced that car again. He sold the chassis to a guy in Texas 2 weeks later, but before he did, he vented the cage and welded the valve shut, grinding it smooth so it looked like just another structural gusset. The secret died with the sale. The Louisiana Blend era was officially over, but the legend of the ghost run of 1989 is still whispered about in southern drag racing bars. Here's what most people don't realize about the history of innovation. It is almost always driven by restriction. The NHRA's crackdown didn't stop cheating. It just forced the cheaters to become better engineers. Doc wasn't a villain. He was a pioneer who forced the sport to evolve. He made the inspector smarter. He made the fuel testing better. In a weird way, he improved the sport by trying to break it. Racing will always be a friction point between the rulebook and the racer's imagination. As long as there's a trophy and a check at the finish line, there will be someone in a garage late at night looking at a rule and asking, "What does this not say?" That's the beauty of it. The car that follows every rule to the letter is usually the car that finishes second. And in the world of legacy motoring, second place is just a first loser. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the chemistry and cunning of the golden age of cheating, and you want to see more stories about the mechanical dark arts, hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment below. Do you think what Doc did was wrong, or was it just good racing? I read every comment. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.